McDermott. In this video, we're going to look at two campaigns, two battles that were absolutely critical, allowing General Scott and his little army to approach Mexico City. But before those two actions, General Scott and his army needed to complete their stay in the town of Pueblo. Pueblo was situated in the middle of an agricultural paradise, at least as far as the Americans were concerned. They enjoyed a wealth of agricultural abundance, and they were able to contract for supplies to sustain their force. Many of the locals appeared friendly and were happy to sell to purchasing agents who met their contractual obligations on time. These Americans actually paid for the food that they were consuming. After calling in the small garrisons to consolidate his army, and despite plentiful criticism and much trepidation from Washington, General Scott had cut his ties to Veracruz, leaving 400 soldiers in Puebla to hold the town and provide security for a medical detachment and for 1,800 sick men that he was required to leave behind. General Scott was prepared to resume the advance to Mexico City with 10,738 soldiers, combat-ready soldiers. It would be 3 months before he received the reinforcements necessary before he could re-secure communications to Veracruz on the coast. On 7 August, the march began, and after breaking out of the mountains, the Americans could see their objective far ahead. Mexico City lay roughly in the center of a shallow basin, which was some 32 by 46 miles in size. The low ground is an ancient lake bed, and in 1847, remnants of the former of several large lakes and marshes still existed. The best approach to the city was from the north or the east, but the Mexican army had prepared and occupied extensive defensive positions in those particular areas. The southern approach to Mexico City was dominated by 3 large lakes, effectively channeling traffic from that direction. The largest of the 3 was Lake Texcoco, directly east of the city. Lake Calco lay further south, and extensive marshes connected those 2 lakes. West of Lake Calco was the third body of water, Lake Exchimilco, and farther west of that lake was an extensive lava bed of broken ground flanked by a mountain farther to the west. After making contact with the enemy east of the city, a careful reconnaissance was conducted, and General Scott decided to approach the capital indirectly, bypassing the heavily defended direct routes into Mexico City. The avenue of advance he chose had a major drawback, as it led through a choke point between that last large lake and the moonscape of volcanic debris and lava rubble called the Pedregal. The space available for the army to maneuver through that checkpoint was constricted by those 2 obstacles, and the Mexicans were sure the Pedregal, some 2 miles wide, was impenetrable and could not be traversed by an army. Once again, the topographical engineers led by Major Lee set to work, and when a rough trail through the lava beds was located, a detail of 500 men improved it with pick and shovel. 3 infantry brigades, helping to manhandle artillery pieces, successfully crossed the Pedregal, and on 19 August were on the flanks of the Mexican army, General Gabriel Valencia's 7,000 strong Army of the North. The Mexican troops were busy establishing camps and building defensive positions on an isolated hill near the village of Contreras, which gave its name to the action. While the Mexican commander, General Valencia, was aware of Americans in the lava bed, he was convinced they could not get through and was surprised by their arrival. Attacking the Mexican positions, the assault came under fire from 22 pieces of Mexican artillery. the American attack stalled, although the troops were able to hold their positions. And a 4th Brigade was on the trail through the Pedregal and moving to their support. That night, the Mexican commander refused orders to withdraw from his position, to spike his cannon, and to occupy a better defensive position closer to Mexico City. He refused because he believed the Americans did not have sufficient strength to continue their attack. Meanwhile, an enterprising American scout, a lieutenant named Zealous Bates Tower, was exploring a gully which took him behind the enemy's position. During a miserable night, marked by wind and cold rain, the 3 brigades totaling about 4,500 men followed Lieutenant Tower's lead and prepared a surprise. At first light on the 20th of August, a demonstration to the Mexicans' front focused their attention, and then the American troops assaulted out of the gully. Their attack shocked the enemy with a volley of fire followed by a wild bayonet charge. The additional pressure from the 4th Brigade, recently arrived during the storm, caused the Mexican force to collapse, and those defensive positions and camps were quickly overrun by the Americans. In less than 20 minutes, the surviving Mexicans were in full retreat with cavalry trampling the infantry. The Mexican Army of the North was destroyed as an organization, and General Valencia was court-martialed and subsequently shot for not withdrawing his forces as ordered. The door was now open for General Scott's little army to drive directly on Mexico City, less than 6 miles to the north. About 700 Mexican soldiers had been killed, and an additional 843, to include 4 generals, were taken prisoner, while American casualties totaled 60 men killed and wounded. The 22 pieces of Mexican artillery were captured, along with 700 packed mules and a large quantity of small arms and ammunition. A senior Mexican government minister began to better understand his country's army now that the Americans were approaching the capital. And he wrote, quote, "The soldiers in general are Indians, forcibly made to serve. These Indians have little or no concept of nationality, and no interest whatsoever in maintaining an order of things in which they figure only as beasts of burden. Nevertheless, it must be said that aside from not being cowards, they have great endurance in the campaign. They have shown that they can cross hundreds of leagues over bad roads barefoot, badly clothed, and worse fed, and this without committing any act of insubordination. Without doubt, they would be as good as the soldiers of any country. The trouble, therefore, with the Mexican army is not with the soldiers, but with the officers, who, with a few and honorable exceptions, are assuredly the most ignorant on earth." And so, comments from a senior Mexican government official concerning the Army's officer corps, which obviously left a great deal required. They were ill-trained, entitled, superior, undependable, undisciplined. And they were very, very poor leaders of a soldiery that appeared to be more disciplined and more dependable than they were. Newly promoted Major Lee had been instrumental in successfully getting units through that lava moonscape, the Pedregal, and by repeatedly moving back and forth during the night, he'd also been the key individual keeping General Scott and brigade commanders informed. His personal initiative ensured units were coordinated for the attack on the morning of the 20th of August. General Scott recognized Major Lee's contribution and commended him for what he described as, quote, "the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by any individual during the campaign." And as a result, General Scott awarded him a lieutenant colonel's brevet rank. The Mexican retreat from Contreras quickly became a mob of cavalry, artillery, infantry soldiers, wagons, families, servants, and camp followers intermingled in a mad scramble on the road toward Mexico City. Seeing the panic, other Mexican troops left their positions and joined the mob in their stampede, turning the road into a quagmire, causing wagons as well as artillery pieces to bog down and be abandoned. American observers from a nearby church tower concluded that General Santa Anna was dealing with an out-of-control rabble that could be dispersed if quickly attacked. And that is exactly what took place. An attack against Mexican positions in that choke point opened it up for the army to advance without having to go through that laborious trail in the Petrogas. Beyond Contreras, a causeway channeled the American troops who were intent on crossing a bridge over the Churubusco River. A sudden blast of concentrated enemy fire from Mexican positions near the bridge and along the far bank of the river, as well as from the San Mateo convent on the left side of the bridge, surprised and stopped the American advance. Fields of tall corn surrounded and obscured the convent, and a hasty reconnaissance failed to identify how strongly the place was actually defended. It turned out that the convent was an extensive stone building inside a stone wall, and the Mexicans were energetically working to complete earthworks to strengthen those defenses. The action opened with American troops attacking to isolate the convent by seizing the bridge across that Churubusco River. The near end was held by an entrenched enemy force that successfully turned back 2 American assaults before they were overwhelmed by Americans who had crossed the river farther down and attacked their position from the rear. 192 prisoners and 3 pieces of artillery were captured in that position, and the convent was then effectively surrounded. The American artillery preparation for the initial attack to take the convent was minimal, and a piecemeal assault by troops who were fed into the fight as they arrived was repulsed with serious casualties. Additional troops joined a second attack, which found soldiers getting lost in the surrounding cornfields before finally locating their objective. The next attack also failed, with serious losses. Small arms and artillery fire from the convent was heavy and accurate, and the Americans found themselves in a fight with an enemy who refused to cave in. Although some of the Mexican defenders recognized their hopeless situation and wanted to surrender, they were prevented by members of the San Patricio Battalion, a unit of Irish Americans who were deserters from the American Army and who had joined the Mexican Army. The San Patricios hesitated to surrender, and they chose to fight on, fearing the punishment they'd received from their former comrades in the American Army. In one instance, an artillery duel lasting over an hour resulted in the Americans losing 24 men and 14 horses killed before they were able to pull their guns back. When American artillery finally began to bring accurate fire on the convent, soldiers were able to scale the walls and get inside and into the building. The defenders continued to fight until an American officer waved a white flag, which encouraged them to lay down their arms. 7 pieces of artillery and over 1,200 prisoners, including 3 Mexican generals, were captured. Among the prisoners were 85 San Patricios, those Irish-born deserters from the American Army who had chosen to join their Catholic co-religious in the Mexican Army. They had caused the majority of the casualties among the American soldiers who were assaulting the convent, and their fears of retribution were justified as they were subsequently court-martialed. While the Americans suffered 1,052 casualties during the fighting at Contreras and Churubusco, General Santa Anna's situation was considered even more serious, as he saw 1/3 of his total force melt away as a result of these 2 actions. The San Patricios were celebrated as heroes by the Mexicans, who welcomed them as volunteers, coming to the aid of a threatened people. The Americans viewed them as traitors, deserving the death penalty. The 50 who deserted after the war began were court-martialed and eventually executed. They were charged with deserting in the face of the enemy. The others had deserted earlier, before the war was declared, and they received 50 lashes and were branded on the face with the letter D for deserter. A man named George Valentine, an Englishman serving as a soldier in the American Army, later wrote, "I sincerely pitied those poor fellows, many of whom I had reason to believe had been driven to the foolish step they had taken by harsh and cruel usage in the army. The barbarous treatment which soldiers sometimes received in the American Army from ignorant and brutal officers and non-commissioned officers seemed almost incredible. I have frequently seen foolish young American officers violently strike and assault soldiers on the slightest provocation, while to tie them up by the wrists as high as their hands would reach, with a gag in their mouths, was a common punishment for trivial offenses. In fact, such a bad state of feeling seemed to exist between soldiers and officers in the American Army throughout my service, I was not surprised that it should lead to numerous desertions. General Scott ordered that 30 of those Irish deserters who had been sentenced to death, those 30 of those who had deserted after war had been declared, he ordered that they be hanged when the national colors were raised over a stone fortress on top of a prominent hill, a terrain feature which hosted the Mexican Military Academy. In fact, the taking of that hill and that facility will be the next battle, the next campaign that we'll take a look at. The sentence was carried out by Colonel William Harney, an early Indian fighter whose rough character had been amply demonstrated before the Mexican War. On the day of execution, the colonel deeply resented that he was being cursed and jeered by the condemned men as nooses were placed over their heads. It seems that they didn't hold back. They were in the process of looking at eternity, and they told Colonel Harney exactly what they thought of the whole situation and of him personally. When he counted the lineup, he noted that only 29 prisoners had been marched out to be hanged. Upon being questioned, the army surgeon replied that the absent man had lost both of his legs in the fight at the San Mateo convent. And the colonel's response was, quote, "Bring that damned son of a bitch out. My order is to hang 30, and by God, that's how many I'm going to hang." End quote. It proved necessary for a sergeant to pull the legless man down against his noose so as to bring an end to his struggles. And that concludes two campaigns that positioned the American Army for a final assault on the Mexican capital. Thanks for watching. Make any comments that you feel might be appropriate. And God bless America.